Pro Football Playbook, presented by the Pigskin Podcast Network. Your source for team news, draft needs, player profiles and rankings, full Senior Bowl, Combine, and NFL draft coverage. News, analysis, discussion. It's in the playbook. Now, here is your host, sports journalist Bill Alvstad, and featured analyst Keith Myers. Hey everyone, welcome into the Pro Football Playbook Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alvstad, sitting down with Keith Myers. We're talking NCAA top 10 college football teams today, college football playoffs, bowl games, remaining schedules, who's in, who's out, all that fun stuff. Keith, welcome in, man. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, this is a great time for us to do this. We're getting into rivalry weekend. Then after that, we've got conference championship games, and then the bowl season will be set. So it's a very interesting time of year for college football.
Yeah. So I brought in my list, but I'm just going off the AP list today. Mm-hmm. And the top four teams in the college playoff hunt as it is listed and kind of where they fall on the national level. And your list is slightly different. And we vary just a little bit down at the bottom as well.
Yeah, I've got the entire college football playoff rankings as they stand right now up. So there are some little differences, but it's amazing how similar they are at this time of year. They were very different early on. A couple of weeks ago when the college football playoff rankings first started, but the wins and losses have happened and things have like coalesced and they're very similar now.
Yeah. And the other thing that I'm going to do too is as we go through this list, I'm going to bring in some players to watch for in the remaining games as we get into the playoffs as well. Some of the big board players that are out there in the top 100 that play for some of these teams that would be a good idea for folks out there following big boards, doing their mock drafts, all that kind of stuff over at NFLmockdraftdatabase.com to be able to kind of watch these guys as they play, just to keep an eye on them. My first team and everyone's first team seems to be Georgia right now. It seems to be kind of the lock, if you will, in this list. And but they do have like a monumental couple games left. Georgia Tech game on November 27th is a give me, obviously, but that Georgia at number 3 Alabama game on December 4th looms large for both of those teams, especially Georgia sitting at the top. We've got an 11-0 record right now. What do you think about them being at the top? And do you see them winning that Alabama game in a couple of weeks?
I do see them winning that Alabama game. I think they're the better team.
They got the better defense.
Yeah, their defense is as good of a defense that we've seen in college football in a decade.
Check this out. I'm just going to run through some players in the top 100 in the NFL draft and just count the number of defensive players on this list. Jordan Davis, defensive lineman, number 13 overall on the big board. Linebacker Nakobe Dean at 25. Then you've got wide receiver George Pickens at 50. Cornerback Darian Kendrick at 58 overall, Adam Anderson at 59 overall as an edge player, safety Lewis Sine at 67 overall, defensive lineman Travon Walker at 73, defensive lineman Devontae Wyatt at 84 overall, edge Nolan Smith at 87 overall, and safety Tyke Smith at 115 overall. I just threw him in because he's really close. And then interior offensive lineman Jamari Salier at 105 overall. Just that roster is loaded, especially on the defensive side.
And that's just the draft eligible, like seniors, and
that is just the draft eligible folks
and juniors. I mean, they've got other major contributors on that defense that are underclassmen that aren't eligible for the draft yet. They will be next year.
And they could end up with 10 players drafted in the top 100. Yeah, which is unreal
in this year's draft. Yes, and then in next year's draft, players off this currently like amazing defense, you've got another 6 that are very likely to go in the top 100 next year. It's just that is a stacked, talented football team.
Yeah.
And I was having this conversation, yesterday or the day before, and we were thinking about, okay, when was the last time we saw a defense this good in college football? And there've been some really good ones. Alabama's had some outstanding ones over the years, but statistically, you have to go back to 1991 and the Washington Huskies, which ended up sharing a national title that year. Steve Entman and that crew. That was the last time you had one that was statistically as good as this Georgia team.
Excellent. Yeah, wow. That goes way back machine, doesn't it?
30 years.
But Georgia's strength of schedule so far is kind of the only blip to me on their pristine record. The hardest game coming in week 2 versus then number 11 Notre Dame, where they squeaked out a 20-19 victory. Everything else has been really pretty easy for them to handle against out of top 25 college football teams. So that's why I think this Alabama game is just such a big game and looming large, and really does give Alabama an opportunity on a struggling team to kind of really show that they belong on this list. So
yeah, I mean, this is an interesting game for a couple of reasons. One, you've got that what you were just saying with, Alabama's had the tougher schedule. They've only got the one loss. Everyone assumes that Georgia's better. I agree. I think that Georgia's better
defensively. There's no question.
So there's all of that. But what comes down to this is, if Georgia loses that game and they become a one-loss team,
yes,
they lose the number 1 overall spot.
But do they fall out of the top 4 overall?
No, there's no way. So you basically, if Alabama wins, you pretty much
does it give another team like Notre Dame an opportunity to come up and win, especially if Notre Dame gets by Stanford, which is probably
that's a given, because Stanford's bad,
and then they'd be at 11-1. Or if you say Michigan, where I've got them at number 6, and we'll get to these teams and we'll talk about them a little bit more, but they play Ohio State, which is my number 2 team. If Michigan can find a way, they've only had 1 win so far against Ohio State in the last 20 years, right? And none in the last 10. This would be a monumental game for Michigan. Could they break through if a team like Georgia were to fall, just based on strength of schedule?
It wouldn't be Georgia that would fall. See, if Georgia loses to Alabama, I think you have Alabama goes as the number 1 overall seed, and Georgia drops to 3. If Georgia wins that matchup, though, Alabama now becomes a 2-loss team. They might be the best 2-loss team out of all the 2-loss teams, but that's where you see.
But they're going to be out of the national championship discussion at that point.
I think they are. I think they drop in. They're going to end up in the final rankings at 5 or 6 outside of the tournament. So that's why that game is so interesting.
And would they be a better team with 2 losses than Cincinnati is undefeated?
Absolutely.
So that's the problem with this scenario, and we'll talk about that a little bit. What's your number 2 overall team right now, Keith?
Right now, I've got it as Ohio State. And I think the AP poll, which is what you're going off of, also has that. They are just playing really good football at the right time. They do have that loss to Oregon early in the season, but it's been a long time since then. Ohio State's continuing to get better every week, and they just blew out a good Michigan State team, which is why they jumped over Alabama. I mean, they're playing really, really well against good football teams.
And they've got a chance
And
to prove it against Michigan on this Saturday, the 27th.
yep, yeah, the rivalry game this Saturday against Michigan. And if they, well, I don't think it matters. No, doing math in my head. Yeah, if they win that game, then they get, I believe, Wisconsin in the Big Ten title game. So that's another. I mean, Wisconsin's not like they're not the powerhouse they are some years, but they're still a good team. And so you'll have. I mean, their strength of schedule, their resume will be as good as you get. With the one blemish being Oregon, but it was in week 2. It was in week 2.
Yes.
Right.
And Oregon's just still a 2-loss team and probably one of the better ones, and we'll talk about that. Ohio State, just mentioning players, has in my count 7 players, draft eligible players out of this group in the top 100. Again, a very, very talented group, and this is a more balanced group. You've got wide receiver Chris Olave at 14 overall. Garrett Wilson's right behind him. Offensive tackle Nicholas Pettit-Freer at 39 overall, probably one of the top 4 offensive tackles. They also have Thaler Munford at 62 overall as their other tackle. Zach Harrison as an edge. Jeremy Ruckert at tight end, one of the better tight ends in this draft coming up. Haskell Garrett and cornerback Seven Banks. Is probably a 4th round kind of prospect, but still nonetheless, just a really talented group. So let's move to Alabama at number 3 overall right now. Alabama is just so loaded. It's crazy. Like as far as just talent overall, top 100 talent in the draft, they're as loaded as anybody else. 10-1, 5-game win streak coming in. They're 7-0 at home, 2-1 on the road. They lost to number 14 Texas A&M 41-38, so in a close game. Remaining schedule: Alabama at Auburn, which is a tune-up for number 1 Georgia at Alabama on December 4th, which is the game of the year in my book.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean that'll be 1 versus 2 or 1 versus 3 by the time they get there, because both of those teams have basically a tune-up game.
Yes,
where they'll be able to. It's basically like it's a glorified practice with people in the stands, because those should both be blowout wins for those 2 teams. That's Alabama is a really good football team with a ton of talent. They're very well coached. Nick Saban continues to make his case for being, arguably the greatest college coach of all time. The problem that they've had this year is that they've given up some big plays. That was really what killed them against A&M. It's interesting that A&M is up to 17, where it feels like a lot of A&M's case for being ranked is that win over Alabama, because they were an unranked team at the time of that game, and then it was like, oh well, they beat Bama, they need to be ranked, and then they played it,
vault them up, yeah,
and then they've played a couple of lesser teams which you're supposed to win against them since then. So it hasn't been like they've actually gone and followed up that Bama win with a couple of other big wins. So
yeah,
I don't know. I look at them. They lack production at quarterback.
Bryce Young, he's
yep.
probably got another year where he really needs to mature into that role.
Yep. And that's really what's hurt them. If they had, they lost their quarterback to the NFL last year, and he's starting for the Patriots and playing really well at the NFL level. And you don't lose a guy like that and not take a step back. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
But if Young had started last year and had that year of like growing into the position, they'd probably be the number 1 team, because that's really what that team is lacking. They're a very talented team as well.
They've got the best left tackle talent in this draft in Evan Neal. Other couple of good players are Jordan Battle at safety. You're going to look at Christian Harris at linebacker. They've got a pair of wide receivers that are going to go in the top 100, Keith, Jamison Williams, and John Mechie. Overall, though, good, solid team. They definitely have a chance. If they can get to that title game, anything can happen with Alabama, but they have to get by Georgia first.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really what it comes down to is if they get into the tournament, then they've got a chance at the title.
Could they face Georgia again in some sort of title matchup if they lose this game?
Yeah, if they lose that game, I think. Well, if they lose that game, they're gonna
fall out. They
might need some help.
But what if that game went to overtime or something? Just like an epic game where they dropped it. They dropped it to 4, and Cincinnati was pushed out somehow. And we'll talk about that because Cincinnati, we need to talk about.
Well, you have that scenario where if they drop to 4, now you're looking at a 1 versus 4 matchup in the semifinals. A rematch. So they'll play on that, and then they'll turn around and play again in the semifinals. I think more likely is if Alabama upsets Georgia in that game, and they end up at 2 and either as the 2-3 matchup or as a 1 seed and a 3 seed with Alabama leaping up into the 1 spot, and then you have a chance for that to be the rematch for the national title. To me, those 3 teams, the 3 teams that we've talked about with Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio State, they're the best 3 teams in the country. And the 4th best team in the country is a large drop-off from those 3. And it doesn't matter how you set that. It doesn't matter whether you're picking Cincinnati, who's currently ranked at 4, or you think, okay, well, they're there because of they're undefeated, but they're not that good.
Yeah.
The 4th best team could be Michigan, or it could be
Notre Dame. Right.
There's a whole list of other teams that we can add in there. The difference between Ohio State and Alabama, Georgia, and whoever that other team is, I think there's just a big drop off.
So let's talk about Cincinnati. They're in right now.
Yep.
11-0. The one quality win on the year is the win against Notre Dame, 24-13, back on October 2nd, when things were still kind of getting figured out. Yep. And their other wins, I'm just going to list them out. Miami of Ohio, Murray State, Indiana, Temple, Central Florida, Navy, Tulane, Tulsa, South Florida, and SMU. The remaining game is East Carolina.
Yeah. That would
be preseason games for Alabama, Ohio State. That schedule right there does not scare anybody.
No. And that's why they have a hard time getting in.
But they're in.
They're in right now, but they could easily be bounced. Because they haven't. I mean, the one Notre Dame game, and that they're.
Can you imagine being in right now and winning your remaining game like 58-0 and getting bounced because you're going to now favor a team that maybe eked out a win, maybe Notre Dame, just clobbered Stanford, so they move up, or that Michigan beats Ohio State, so Ohio State falls out, Michigan comes up, Cincinnati's bumped. I don't know. It'd be tough. It'd be tough to swallow.
It would be tough to swallow, but again, is Cincinnati good?
Why put them there in the first place?
That was my thought. I thought for sure they were going to come in at 5, because then they're on the outside looking in. They play another.
Yeah, but then you're playing games and manipulating the list a little bit by doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because
there it is, folks. The admission that actually goes on.
Well, of course it does. That's why you have a committee. But are they the 4th best team in the country?
With a quality, with not even a quality win, just a win against Notre Dame early in the season, and that's it. They've got like 2 or 3 players on that team that are going to be drafted in the top 150 players.
Yeah.
Their cornerback, Ahmad Gardner, is amazing. And then, they've got an edge that's interesting, and they've got that's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Are they on a neutral field? right? Or heck, even in their home stadium, Michigan comes in to play Cincinnati. Who's going to win? Who's going to be favored? Michigan's going to be favored by 14, right?
That's what I think that is inherently an issue in this situation is you got teams like Baylor, you got teams like Cincinnati, other teams like BYU that just don't have the schedule that these other big time programs have. Mm-hmm. And yet here we are, we're all trying to figure out where they fit, if they do fit. And sometimes better teams end up getting pushed out in this scenario.
Yeah, and I think that that's the problem that Cincinnati's going to have. It's also the reason why they're joining the Big 12. They're joining the Big 12 here in a couple of years in order to give themselves access to a Power 5 schedule. So they can come in and play against a...
They're going to have to turn up the recruiting, I can tell you that much.
Yeah, they are, but they're going to be able to because they're going to have they're going to have Power 5 money. So they've already admitted that they're not, that the conference that they're in isn't going to give them the quality and stuff that they want. They're joining the Big 12 for a reason, and the fact that they've put together a good team, they've got a good coach. Luke Fickell is a fantastic coach, and I think the fact that they're joining the Big 12 gives them a method for keeping him, because otherwise, he would be headed to USC or somewhere after the season. But the fact that they're joining a Power 5 conference means they could hold on to him. But he's that's a team that until they get there, until they start playing a tougher schedule, it really doesn't. We don't know how good they are, and we're going to get an opportunity to see them most likely as the 4 seed. Get destroyed.
And I think the most interesting player on their roster that everybody really wants to see is Desmond Ridder, since the quarterback, because this class is so weak. He's probably like the 4th best quarterback in a big board typically, and it'll be interesting to see if he can work his way up into the first round in the draft just based on the position need in the NFL this year. All right. We'll come back to that. I think that's going to be a discussion.
That is going to be a discussion. So those are the 4 teams that are currently in. On the outside looking in, we've got Michigan at 10-1, who plays Ohio State. You've already talked about that. That's a win you're in game for either of those teams. And
Aiden Hutchinson is one of those players that could be, a top player drafted in the NFL draft. Just throwing it out there. He's likely, probably on the big board. He's ranked 5th.
He's
overall.
He's a top 5 player.
So, and then you've got Notre Dame, you've got Oklahoma State. Each has 1 loss. They're all 10-1. The remaining game that Notre Dame has is at Stanford. Michigan, we just talked about, is Ohio State at Michigan. And then Oklahoma State is interesting because their strength of schedule has just been really marginal. They lost to Ohio State. You talked to me about not Ohio State, Iowa State. They lost to them on October 23rd. Their remaining game, though, is the rivalry game at number 7 Oklahoma. Oklahoma is at Oklahoma State. So that'll be a great game.
It's a pair of 10-1 teams.
And Oklahoma State doesn't have really anybody on their roster. This is the definition of a team that is all team oriented as opposed to single players making a big difference.
So what do you think of Notre Dame? Because Notre Dame, they're 10-1, but their schedule this year is not the typical Notre Dame schedule. Like as an independent, they've got these contracts with these different schools, these rivalries with teams like USC and Stanford. So they usually have this really tough schedule, which makes it hard for them.
But you've had USC and Stanford's had off years.
Yeah, and so like Stanford's bad.
So their only real quality win this year has been Wisconsin. At number 18 currently.
Yeah, Wisconsin's not even in this consideration. I guess they're 14th in the college football
Okay.
playoff committee's rankings.
Okay.
But
Yeah, their wins came against Florida State, Toledo, Purdue, Wisconsin, Virginia Tech, USC, UNC, Navy, Virginia, Georgia Tech. Those are all really bad teams.
yeah,
Those
and
are all teams that top 10 college football teams have soundly beaten in their respective schedules. So there's nothing special about the schedule so far for Notre Dame. And to be listed at 5, you're looking at all the other attributes, and some of the individual players like Kyle Hamilton at safety, with the best safety in the game. Running back Kyron Williams, is a top kind of 50-ish player overall, maybe the second best running back in the draft right now. And after that, they just don't have a lot of special players per se. But here they are, and they're 10-1. Is Michigan at 10-1 at currently number 6 a better team? I think we're going to find out. We're going to find out because Ohio State plays Michigan.
Yep, I think they're a better team than Cincinnati or Notre Dame, but they've got to beat Ohio State to get in. And if they lose,
they're out of the top 10.
Yeah,
they're fighting for a bowl game that's like the Fiesta Bowl or whatever.
Yeah, and so, but if they win, they're in, and they'll jump over those other two teams. And so this is why playing in a Power 5 conference and having that level of competition just on your schedule week in, week out matters, because they're going to be, if they win, they're in, and it's not going to matter what Cincinnati and Notre Dame do, right?
All right. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, if they win, they're in there. But they're, the wins this year, again, they've landed on some teams that are typically a little better and not good this year. For example, Western Michigan, Washington. Washington is an awful team this year. Northern Illinois, Rutgers, number 18. Wisconsin is a good quality win. Nebraska's down, but they won. Northwestern, Indiana, Penn State, and Maryland. That's at least a 9-win season right there, even if Washington came in better. So they're at 10-1. Their loss came against Michigan State. Michigan State has a pretty decent team, but just out of the top 10.
Yeah,
they're a 2-loss team.
Michigan State's a really good team, and but it comes down to the Big Ten East has Ohio State, Michigan State, Penn State. That's a group of 4 teams that beat up on each other, and you have to end up playing 3 good teams every single year, and that's not with your if Wisconsin's good and you play them, or Iowa, or one of those other programs comes in, you always have those 3 teams on your schedule, and it makes it hard to get through an entire season unscathed. But if you get through it 10-1 or 11-1, you deserve to be in the tournament, because you've played some of the top teams in the country, and if you get through them as a 1-loss team, you deserve to go in. And this is where you and I were talking about how does Cincinnati get bumped? Well, if Michigan wins over Ohio State, they're going to get in. But does Ohio State with a loss to
another top 5 team?
Yeah, they will have lost to now number 2 Michigan, and an Oregon team back in week 2. Do they drop to 4 and still sit there in the tournament? I could see it happening. And so they drop, but they only drop to 4, and they kick Cincinnati back to 5. That's one of those scenarios where if you're a Cincinnati fan and you're worried about getting bounced out, you're rooting for Ohio State hard, and you're rooting for Georgia.
Yes.
In those 2 games that we've already talked about, because you want.
Is there any scenario in which Cincinnati stays in the top 4?
Yeah, that's why you're rooting for Georgia and Ohio State, because you want those teams that are above you to stay there and to knock out the teams that are, potentially going to push you. So you knock Alabama down, and maybe you can leapfrog them and stay at 4, and Alabama drops to 5. Or you knock Michigan completely out of the conversation. You want Oklahoma to beat Oklahoma State, so they're not there knocking on the door anymore. And so then you're left with like Notre Dame. Can they find an excuse to put Notre Dame in front of you? That's what you're rooting for if you're Cincinnati. And honestly, we'll see what the committee does, because they just haven't played anyone. We don't know if they're a good team.
And they won't, and they will not have.
No,
when all of this gets settled.
Yeah. The one thing I will say, if Notre Dame gets in over Cincinnati, when Cincinnati beat Notre Dame, I would personally have a problem with that, because the games on the field have to matter. And if you beat them head to head.
Yeah, but who's going to give Cincinnati even a chance to win a game in the playoffs?
Nobody. They're going to go and they're going to get destroyed in the first round of the playoffs, no matter what happens there.
I'm not so sure, but
the question is, do they deserve to be there, and do they deserve the money that you get for getting into the tournament? And I always
like an underdog. I like a team like Cincinnati, for every reason that everyone else likes them. But when it comes right down to it, you've got to put the best teams forward.
I do, but I think I don't believe that Notre Dame is a better team. I think that Notre Dame is highly overrated, based on their schedule. So, to me, if it comes down to those two teams, you put in Cincinnati because they beat them. It was the same scenario earlier in the year when it was Oregon and Ohio State.
Okay, let me ask you this: Oregon. We haven't talked about the 7 teams that I think are kind of in the next big group.
Okay.
The AP's got them listed, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there couldn't be some movement here. So I'm just going to run through them really quick, and let's see kind of where you think that they might be, and if there are any one of those teams could come up and disrupt. Oklahoma State at 10-1. They face Oklahoma in their final game. Ole Miss at number 8. They're 9-2, led by Matt Corral, considered one of the best quarterbacks in the draft. Baylor sitting there at 9-2, but they haven't faced anybody. Literally, their wins are against Oklahoma, basically, and they did beat BYU.
Oklahoma and BYU gives them 2 quality wins.
Yes,
because Oklahoma's 10, BYU's 13,
and they're sitting at 9 for a reason. Oklahoma at 10, they're 10-1. They lost to Baylor. Then you've got 3 9-2 teams that have a chance, or you could legitimately say could be in that top 10 or should be in the top 10. Oregon at number 11. Oregon just had a really bad loss against Utah. They got blown out in Utah. I don't have any idea what happened.
They got the best. They have the best win in terms of resume in college football right now, and in all of college football.
Ohio State.
Win at they beat Ohio State on the road without their best player, because Kayvon Thibodeau who's probably going to be the number 1 overall pick in the draft this year, did not play in that game, and it didn't matter. Oregon still beat them.
Yes.
So that's that quality win. They got blown out by Utah in a game that
38-7 just last week.
Yeah, it was.
That's where I talk about timing. That's the worst possible time to lose a game and lose big, is this time of the year, because
they dropped
totally skews everything.
4. Yes. They dropped from 4 to 11 on one loss,
which is so that's where you have to kind of decide who's your best 9-10 win team at the end of the year.
If Georgia loses to Alabama, they'll drop from 1 to 3. Whereas Oregon, without their loss, dropped from 4 to 11.
But they do have the other loss against Stanford.
Which, God, Stanford's bad.
October 2nd, so that was early. So, and the other teams are Michigan State, losses to Purdue, and Ohio State.
And they got blown out.
And then blown out by Ohio State, like 56-7, something like that. And then BYU 9-2, losses to Boise State and Baylor. That Boise State game really hurts them. So out of Oregon and Michigan State, you could really make an argument that Oregon's the better team.
Yep. Michigan State's not going to have an opportunity to climb back in because they've knocked themselves out of the Big Ten title game with that loss to Ohio State, and so that title game spot will go to the winner of.
I really want to see Kenneth Walker run the ball, though.
Yeah,
like one of the best running backs in the game.
Agreed. So because Michigan and Ohio State play each other, and the winner plays, I think it's going to be Wisconsin in the title game. Those teams have opportunities to jump or make moves. Michigan State just doesn't. They don't have that extra game to make that move. So for them, they're stuck. And that's
Oregon might be stuck too. They're playing Oregon State, and that's always a tough game for them.
Yep. Well, okay, but Oregon is an interesting case because Oregon's going to play Oregon State. They should beat Oregon State. Oregon State's a better team than most people will think because they're traditionally a doormat in the Pac-12, but they're actually a pretty good team this year. They're going to be going to a bowl game, but Oregon should beat Oregon State. And what happens the week after in the Pac-12 title game? They're going to play Utah again. And so if they play Utah and they beat them, they're able to avenge the loss that they had 2 weeks ago or last week.
And Utah will probably come in ranked, pretty darn close to, in the top 10 or just outside.
Yeah, because they're 19th right now in the college football playoff ranking. Utah is. They play Colorado, which is going to be,
and they're 16th in the AP.
Yeah, and so they're going to be 12th or somewhere in that range probably after this week.
Correct.
And so you're going to have Oregon, which should move up after beating Oregon State. They're going to be.
So there's a chance that Oregon could improve their bowl position, but there's no chance Oregon comes all the way up again.
I don't know, because if they're 8 or 9 and they turn around and they beat the team that beat them, so they can make the case that that was a fluky game or whatever. You jump to 8 with a win over Oregon State, and then can you go from 8 to 4?
Georgia would have to beat Alabama soundly for Alabama to fall.
Alabama
Cincinnati would have to lose or have just a really close game at Eastern Carolina.
Mm-hmm. But if
Ohio State would have to lose against,
I think Ohio State has to beat Michigan.
Okay, you think so? Because Michigan needs to fall out.
Ohio State would beat Michigan.
Oregon would come up and maybe get the 4th spot.
Georgia and Ohio
with 2 losses.
Yep, Georgia and Ohio State would stay 1 and 2. You get Bama to lose to Georgia, so they drop.
Would you put Oregon above? Notre Dame would have to lose. Michigan, Ohio, because Michigan would
lose. They'd lose. They would have lost to us. But Notre Dame hasn't played anybody. They're not basically.
But they're sitting up there now.
Yes, but
so how do you knock them off?
You can leapfrog them by beating the team that beat you, and so Oregon's case would be that they're lower now because of that loss, but we're going to negate that loss by coming back and beating that same team.
Yeah, but they did lose to Stanford as well. Notre Dame would beat Stanford in their last game, possibly. So they'd have to figure that head-to-head out. Yeah, it's interesting. I just don't see it happening. I think Oregon's on the outside looking in. Even I think they are. Win.
I think they are too, but I do think they can make life interesting with those next 2 wins, getting to 11-2. And
they can, but they're going to play in a solid bowl game.
Oh, they'll go to the Rose Bowl. I mean, that's really what's at stake for them is the Rose Bowl. And so they win those 2. They win the Pac-12. They go to the Rose Bowl, and they'll play Michigan. Likely. Michigan State, whichever one of those teams ends up.
Not Wisconsin. Higher. You think Wisconsin is out at this point?
Well, I think I personally don't think that Wisconsin's going to beat Michigan or Ohio State. Right. So the winner of Michigan, Ohio State goes to the college football playoff, and the loser goes to the Rose Bowl because Wisconsin's going to get another loss in the Pac-12 title game.
Interesting.
And that'll knock them down. So to me, that gives me.
So there's a lot of clarity coming after this weekend's round of games. There's a lot of great games this weekend.
There's a lot of great
if you're
games
a
this week,
football
and
fan
another
of college football, this is the weekend to turn on the TV and just
Oh
sit
yeah,
in front of your TV.
There's some
weekend.
fantastic games this week with all these rivalry games. There's another fantastic slate of games the week after with all of the conference title games, because that's when you get Alabama, Georgia. That's when you get Oregon with a chance to rematch against Utah. And then
right.
So
in the Pac-12 championship game,
all of it. Yeah, Wisconsin having to play the winner of Michigan, Ohio State. Like, these next 2 weeks are probably the best 2 weeks of college football, other than the bowl season.
Yes,
it's fantastic. Lot of fun. It is a lot of fun this weekend.
I think that wraps it up. We talked about a lot. I think there's more clarity in a couple of weeks, and I think we probably have another show to address that. Let me see what's on the schedule here for the podcast.
While you're looking at the schedule, I wanted to point out one weird scenario about the Pac-12 or the Pac-12 North. Really, if Oregon loses to Oregon State, which is unlikely, but it happens, and Washington State beats Washington, and Washington's pretty bad this year, but Washington also has Washington State's number as in that rivalry. But if those two results go the way they go, Washington State ends up going to the Pac-12 title game, despite the fact that they started 1-3 and fired their coach in early October. They would still go to the Pac-12 North title game.
Wow.
How messed up is that?
That's messed up.
The Pac-12 is really weird this year. Like, it's just a landmine, our minefield of weirdness, and somehow that weirdness is going to blow up on somebody. So
I don't. After this week, I don't have anything specifically tied to playoff scenarios or bowl games or anything like that. We'll work it in, because we've got a full schedule. On the NFL side of the show, we're doing we're starting to keep track of the top teams now in the playoff pushes, and then in college we're doing top 10 lists. I mean, we're really getting into the players
looking at
now.
Players.
Yeah, well, as we head towards the draft.
As we get towards bowl season, we're going to be talking about. We're talking about players, but it's also hey, you want to go watch quarterbacks play? And find out which one's going to be the top quarterback in the draft. Here's the bowl games to go watch.
Yes.
And honestly, I'm going to tell you.
Yes, exactly.
Wherever Cincinnati's playing, you're going to want to watch them for the quarterback, and wherever Ole Miss is playing. Those are the two that I'm really interested in as far as quarterback play.
Yeah.
Ole Miss is interesting. I mean, that's Mike Leach. Isn't right? Isn't that where he went, or did he go to Mississippi?
I can't remember.
Ole Miss or Mississippi State? I can't remember which one of those two, but I know those two teams play each other.
Ole Miss and Mississippi State play. Yeah,
they play each other this week. That's Lane Kiffin versus Mike Leach in the game of the really, really weird college coaches.
Yeah, but good offensive minds. Both.
Great offensive minds, but just very weird individual people. So I'll probably be watching that game, because I expect there to be something entertaining to happen on one or both of the sidelines.
Yeah, interesting. Fantastic. Fun. Okay. So let's get out of here, and we'll see you next week. The next show we've got on the NFL side is top 2 teams, NFL teams in each division, and we're going to go walk through that, and that'll kind of give us playoff ideas as we push forward, and games to watch and pay attention to as that happens. And then I think we're talking about top 10 college tight ends in the next draft show that we do.
The tight ends or wide receivers? I thought we were doing wide receivers first.
Maybe it is wide receivers. I might be looking too far. I think, my list shows us already having done college wide receivers, because we're a little behind.
Okay, that's good, because I've been prepping for wide receivers and not for tight ends.
Well, so good. You can lead that conversation.
If we're talking about tight ends, I've got more homework to do between now and then, but I've got homework to do anyway. Let's get out of here.
Okay. Find Keith. Yeah, at Myers NFL. I'm at Alvstad NFL. The show is at PF_Playbook. You can find our website at profootballplaybook.co. You can find us on your favorite podcast apps. We're currently on iTunes and getting listed. Since the show is so new, we're getting listed on Spotify and all those other platforms, but you can find us on YouTube for sure. Right now, we have our own YouTube channel. Follow us at Pro Football Playbook and subscribe. Make sure you subscribe. That way, every week, you've got our show landing, doing 2 shows a week, one focused on the NFL side, the other one focused on the NFL draft. I think when we get into January, February, after the NFL season shuts down, both shows will be focused on the draft moving forward and players, and we'll have guests on to kind of help us.
We'll also be looking at team needs for, how it's one thing to know who the top, quarterbacks are and their strengths and stuff, but then we'll start placing them and going, which teams need a quarterback and which ones that are they most likely to draft, or are they likely to skip the position in this year's draft?
And we'll do a bunch of mock drafts as well.
Yes, we will.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So let's get out of here. So let's get out of here. And next week, have a great Thanksgiving, everybody. And if it's around the NFL, it's going to be on the Playbook. Thanks for listening to the Pro Football Playbook podcast. Follow Keith at Myers NFL. Bill is at Alvstad NFL. The show is at PF_Playbook. Listen and subscribe on your favorite podcast app or YouTube and at our website, profootballplaybook.co.